Hey y'all, I'm Hope. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm wrapping up all the books I read in November, which is a pretty hit or miss reading month for me, and I ended up reading mostly books that were either ebooks or library books that I've since turned in. So I only have one physical book to actually show you, which means I have my little list here so I can remember everything that I read. But it was a interesting reading month because there were some things that I really liked. Mostly things from like authors that I had already read before that I knew I was going to enjoy, and then some other things that I branched out and tried, and those were the kind of hit and miss pieces of the month. But the first thing I ended up reading was The Lover by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, which is a kind of fairy tale-esque short story about a woman named Judith who she falls in love with this man who shows up in her town, and he marries her older sister. And then shortly after that, another man shows up in town, and Judith finds herself caught in a kind of complicated relationship between her sister's now husband and this other man who's shown up in town. It's very fairy tale feeling. I don't think it's a retelling of anything specific, but it very much feels like a fairy tale the way it's told and the way it ends. So I think it was a really interesting story. I think I gave it 4 stars. I think pieces of this kind of went over my head, and there were some moments where I felt like it was trying to say something, but I didn't get what it was trying to say. It's also a fairly simple story. I read it fairly quickly, and I think it's a fun one. It just isn't my favorite thing that I've read from her. I think it's a good one if you want to like get a taste of her writing before diving into one of her longer works, but she has another book that's a kind of fairy tale-esque story that's Gods of Jade and Shadow, and I love that so much that I think I just had like slightly higher hopes for this one. So not my favorite thing, but I think it's still really good and a really good short story if you just want something like quick and fun to read in an evening. The next thing I read was System Collapse by Martha Wells. I think this is the only physical book I have to actually hold up. I read this as an ARC, and then my physical copy arrived shortly after I finished it because I was kind of pushing it on my getting that ARC read in time. But this is the 7th book in the Murderbot Diary series, and it's a direct follow-up to book 5. So if you haven't read the series, books 1 through 4 form like one specific arc in chronological order, and then book 5 kind of continues on from there, but then book 6 jumps back and is a prequel to book 5. And happens in between books 4 and 5. And then this one, book 7, continues straight off of book 5. Which sounds really confusing. It's really not too bad. But this one, I went back last month and read Network Effect so I could I reread that so I could read this. And I'm really glad that I did that because this follows on like just a few hours or possibly days after the end of Network Effect. So this one, it was really helpful to have that kind of refreshed memory on who everybody is and what the kind of situation is, and I can't tell you a whole lot about the plot of this one without spoiling book 5. So this one is basically following Murderbot as they are dealing with the aftermath of the events of book 5, and kind of most centrally dealing with their own feelings about what's happened in book 5. This is a book that I think more than any other book in the series really directly forces Murderbot to think about its own emotions and deal with its own trauma. I think all of the earlier books kind of deal with those issues, but this one is where Murderbot really is forced to confront things head on and deal with the fact that it has like human-like emotions and that it has to like be kind to itself in some ways. So I think this is really interesting, and I like the conflict in here. There's something to do with some colonists on a planet, and the solution that Murderbot comes up with for the dilemma that they're facing is just brilliant, and I think it works so well with Murderbot's character. I just loved everything about this. There's also some really fantastic side characters, including one of my favorites, Rathi. He features heavily in this, but there's also a couple of new side characters that show up at the end of Network Effect who are central characters in this story, and I just loved it. I liked the way that the group dynamic had shifted and Murderbot was having to try and deal with that and like get to know new people. And I just loved everything about this. I think it's a really great continuation of Murderbot's story, and I think we're getting a couple more Murderbot books if I remember correctly. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what's going to come next for Murderbot because I feel like this creates a more solid jumping off point for further stories than book 5 did, which it was clear because book 5 was leading to this one. So I really enjoyed this, and I'm excited to see what comes next for Murderbot. After that, I read Hemlock Island by Kelly Armstrong, and I think this was my least favorite book of the month. I'm looking at my ratings here, and I'm correct. I gave this a 2.5 stars. This is a horror novel, but I went into it thinking it was a thriller or a mystery thriller, and I was wrong. So I only heard like one or two people talk about it, and I never heard anyone really talk about what genre it was. And something about the description made me think it was a mystery thriller. And then I was very wrong. I should have looked it up because I went in and I read like the first 100 pages with this kind of wrong assumption. And I was like, I really don't understand what's happening. We're not really getting much of a mystery. There aren't really a lot of clues happening. But there's a lot of like group dynamics and group drama that I don't think really works, because I think the characters in this were pretty simplistic and not very interesting. And I think a lot of the group dynamics, we were being told something was true about relationships between characters, and then the way they behaved just didn't match up with that at all. And it wasn't like an unreliable narrator situation. It was just like, it didn't work. It didn't match up. So I had some issues with that. And then I realized it was a horror novel because I was reading the back of it and I was looking at who all had blurbed it and realized it was all horror authors. So then I kind of readjusted my expectations, and I ended up having a good enough time with the last part of the book that I gave it like 2.5. It was still like an okay book. It was fun to read, but I feel like I was so frustrated with the characters making stupid decisions, especially because one of them is explicitly like a horror movie fan, and there's a lot of mentions of like how she knows all these things about the genre and how she kind of like feels she's in a horror movie. And then she kept doing the stupid shit that people in horror movies do. It was like there wasn't any point for her to be a horror movie fan because she didn't gain anything from that. It didn't alter the way that she approached things at all. There was a lot of stuff too with like the group dynamics about there was like a friend who had been split off from the friend group for reasons unknown. I guess that twist very early on, I kind of figured out what was going on. There was a little additional layer to it that I thought was more interesting, but there was this like kind of secrets from the past thing where the secrets from the past didn't really have any bearing or connection to the horror elements that were going on. And it was also trying to do this kind of like eco-horror thing, but it just felt like it was overstuffed. It was trying to tackle too many topics. It was like divorce, grief and loss, eco-criticism, like what else? The pandemic and how that influenced people's lives. There was just like so many pieces it was trying to do, and it wasn't giving any of them enough attention to do them well. So it ended up just feeling overstuffed and poorly executed to me. I gave it 2.5 stars because I did have like a decent enough time with it. Although upon reflection, I think I would probably actually downgrade it to 2 stars just because I think it's a fairly poorly written book, but I did like a few of the moments in it. There were some really good funny moments that I thought were pretty well done. There was also like some interesting, really creepy moments. I think some of the horror elements were really well described and really gross and creepy. So there were some things that I liked about it, but overall I just didn't think it was very well written. After that, I read another horror novel. This one was The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher. I don't know why I almost said the T. Kingfisher. Anyway, this is The Twisted Ones, and it's a kind of Appalachian horror book, which I really enjoyed. I think I gave this one 4 stars. Oh, I gave it 3.5. There were some things about it that I don't think totally worked. There were kind of 2 halves of the story. It's about this protagonist named Mouse who is going to clear out her grandmother's home after her grandmother has passed away. And the grandmother was a pretty unpleasant person and also a hoarder. So Mouse is going to the house to clear everything out and is kind of dealing with her complicated emotions about her grandmother. But at the same time, there's like spooky things happening in the woods, and she ends up finding a diary that was kept by her grandmother's second husband and reading about these like really disturbing entities that he had encountered at some point in his history and seemed to be encountering again in the woods around the grandmother's home. So Mouse kind of gets caught up in all of that and starts experiencing creepy things for herself. And I thought that both sides of the story were interesting, but I don't think they integrated very well. And I think my problem with that was that the grandmother was the center of one part of the story, and then this kind of, I think she refers to him at several points as like her step-grandfather is the center of the other half of the story, and those 2 pieces never really felt like they totally came together for me. But I did really like the horror elements. I think they were very scary. There was one moment in here that was specifically designed to scare me personally, and I had to like shut my Kindle off and walk away for a minute because I was very unsettled. So I really enjoyed that. I think the horror is really well done, and I also really liked the humor in this book. I always enjoy T. Kingfisher's kind of blend of horror and humor put together. I think it's really fun, and I just enjoy her characters a lot. A lot of them are very like witty and snarky, and I just think it's a fun time. So like I had fun reading this. I just had some issues with the way the 2 halves of the story kind of came together, and I think that the ending felt a little I don't know. There were parts of it where I was like, I don't know why this is happening or what it means for anything for this thing to be happening. I don't know how best to describe it than that. There were some pieces that felt like they didn't totally fit. But I really enjoyed bring my words together, the Appalachian horror aspect of this, because it was just, it reminded me of like, I grew up in a rural area, and so it reminded me a lot of like the stories that people tell in places like that and the kind of folk horror stuff. So I really enjoyed it, and I think it's a fun one. It's just not my favorite T. Kingfisher, but I do want to read, I think I have one more of her horror books left to read, The Hollow Places, so I do want to read that one as well, because I think it's also set in like rural North Carolina, so I'm excited to get to that one. And I still liked it, I just wouldn't be the one I would recommend first. The next thing I read, which is also the penultimate thing that I read, was I think my favorite of the month? No, System Collapse was my favorite. This is my second favorite of the month. And this was Midnight is the Darkest Hour by Ashley Winstead. This is also my first book by Ashley Winstead that I've read, and I will definitely be going back to read her earlier books because I had a great time with this one. I really loved it. I gave it 4.5 stars, but this one is following these two young people in a small, very religious, very conservative, like rural town in the Louisiana Bayou, and strange things start happening when a skull is found in the swamp near the town. And it appears that there might be a serial killer in their midst, but there's also rumors of a supernatural creature known as the Low Man who might be wreaking havoc in the town. There's just like a lot of elements going on here, and it's one of those horror books that I think is really, I think, a mystery thriller. This, I think, better fits like a thriller description, but it definitely leans more towards horror. And I think this one is much more literary. It's trying to tackle both like the horror elements and this the kind of dread in the town, but it's also tackling a lot of other really difficult topics, including like child abuse, religious conservatism, politics, feminism. Like, there's a lot of big topics in it, but I think that Ashley Winstead pulls them all together in a really compelling, well thought out way, and I really enjoyed basically everything about this book. I think the characters are really fascinating in particular, and I liked the way that we would be introduced to a character and then, like in one timeline, there's multiple timelines in this book. There's like a present day timeline and then a kind of past timeline that mostly moves forward from the time that Ruth is 17 until she's about 20, but then occasionally looks a little further back at like when she's 11 or when she's 13. And so we would see somebody in one of those like past timelines or in the future timeline first, see them in one version, and then we'd see them again later in a different timeline and get to learn a little bit more about them that complicated the way that we viewed them. And I think that that was just so well done. I really liked the way there's like little reveals about the different characters, helped all the little puzzle pieces click into place. And I think that this dual timeline thing worked really well for this story. I also just love the moral grayness of it. That is very much a term I would apply to this. I think this is one of the better versions of moral grayness that I have seen in a book, where characters are doing things and you're like, I don't agree with what you're doing necessarily, but I totally understand why you think that's the right thing to do. And I think that was just really well done. The fact that I could understand why characters were doing what they were doing really impressed me, because that's usually an issue I have when I see something described as morally gray. It usually comes off as, you know, either a good guy pretending to be a bad guy or somebody bad being justified for reasons that don't really make sense. So I really enjoyed the way that this book tackled that and presented what I think is one of the better versions of moral grayness I read in a book. But I think my favorite thing about this was like just the atmosphere and the way that all of the different puzzle pieces come together, especially for the two main characters, Ruth and Everett, as they are piecing this mystery together and dealing with the fallout of their actions. I think my only complaint with this was that I'm not sure I totally like the solution for who is behind the murders, because on the one hand it works really well thematically, but on the other hand I feel like it almost undermines its own theme. I don't know how to describe it without giving you spoilers, so I'm just gonna have to leave it at that. But I think that there were some other options for who could have been behind this that would have maybe strengthened the theme even more. But I did like the way that this book ended, and I think it has a very dramatic conclusion that was really interesting, and I definitely want to read more from Ashley Winstead because her writing is just wonderful. Then the final thing I read was quite the tonal shift, because then I read Jujutsu Kaisen Volume 4 which is subtitled I'm Gonna Kill You. The subtitles are always wild on these. But I read Jujutsu Kaisen Volume 4 and had a good time with it. I gave it 3.5 stars. Had kind of the typical experience I have with this series, which is that I'm having a fun time. I take enough of a break between volumes that I typically don't entirely remember what's going on, so it takes me a little bit to get back into the story and figure out who's who and what's happening. And I think that makes it particularly difficult with this, or like it makes it particularly difficult to be totally invested in what's happening here, because the volumes tend to end and begin on these really big dramatic moments, which when I'm only reading one volume every once in a while, I think I'm missing some of the impact there. But I did really enjoy the continuation here. This was a fun little building upon Yuji's story, and I'm excited to see where the series is going to go next. I don't know how to summarize for you any of what's happened, but we did get to see more of some characters that I really like. Gojo obviously is a fan favorite, and Nanami is also a fan favorite. Nanami is currently my favorite character, and I'm really enjoying his parts of the story. In fact, we got a bit of his backstory in this one, and I think that was my favorite chapter, because we get a little bit of Nanami's backstory and his explanation for why he's doing what he's doing, and why he's like involved with helping Itadori. So I think that was a really fun element of this volume, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in Volume 5, because again, we had a very dramatic cliffhanger at the end of Volume 4, so I'm curious to see how that's going to play out in the next volume. So that's pretty much all I read, but I'm really happy with my reading this month. It definitely picked up in terms of the amount I was reading and the kind of pace I was reading at from the previous month, and I'm actually really glad that I have had a variety of star ratings. I think I'm getting better at reading critically and at kind of picking apart why or why not I like a book. That didn't make sense. Picking apart why I like a book versus the things that make me not like it. Maybe that's clearer. I don't know. But I think that it was really good that I had a really broad variety of star ratings, because I think I'm getting a better read on what I like and what some of my issues with books tend to be. But that's pretty much all I have for you today, and I really hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you have, I hope you consider giving it a like, maybe even subscribing to see what comes next. I'm currently posting every Tuesday and Saturday, so there's more content coming soon, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.